Hello, welcome to Stage 2, Counter Dependence and Fight. Let's learn more about how to lead virtual teams in Stage 2. And in this stage, we focus on encouraging your team, handling conflicts, and bringing out the positive effects of diversity. And here is just a reminder of the overview of the team development stages, and now we are in Stage 2. So in this stage, the conflicts are inevitable, but you have to focus on developing your team. And how you can do that is to understand your team better in terms of diversity and then handle the conflicts that may occur. And working in virtual teams, of course, it opens up the global collaboration opportunities in many different ways. And working in multicultural virtual teams can be very rewarding in many ways. However, if there is a lack of cultural awareness and communication skills, of course, there is always room for misunderstandings and possible conflicts. So here we now focus on three major frameworks to do with cultural diversity. Let's look at those first. The first one you may already be familiar with, Hofstede's cultural dimensions, that is very well known. It's quite old already, but nevertheless it's still used widely. And it focuses on the assumption that societies face similar issues concerning certain values and certain relationships. And mainly there are four cultural dimensions: power distance, collectivism versus individualism, femininity versus masculinity, and uncertainty avoidance. And later on, a few more were added: long-term versus short-term orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. Let's look at these in a bit more detail. So here you can see the definitions of cultural dimensions. Please look at them closely and please note the link at the top where you can view and read more about these. So you can actually get the country scores for each of these cultural dimensions and do a comparison. Let's say, for example, with the team members and their cultural dimensions, and try to understand the differences and the possible conflicts that may arise through the dimensions. And there are also some good examples in the explanations following each of these country scores. So please have a look at those. Of course, there is also some criticism, as I said. So although it is used widely, this framework, but it's good to remember that these country scores represent only averages. So I'm sure you know about cultural identities and how to always think of, how much of these general values you can apply to an individual. Also, it's important to remember that national boundaries are just one way to define a culture. So it's very important to remember that, although the country scores are represented as national scores, people or cultures are not always divided by such borders. And of course, everything changes over time. So it's important to always view it a bit critically in terms of what is happening in the world at the moment. However, cultures tend to change quite slowly, so in that sense, it is okay. Another famous one is Hall's context theory, and this is also an old one already, but nevertheless, it's still very valid and it is used widely. And what it means is he divides cultures into high context and low context cultures. And what it means is high context people tend to put a lot of communication in the context. So the communication is high in the context. And what it means is low context cultures tend to speak out what they mean. So their communication is not so high in the context, but it's more in the words that are said. And of course, as I already mentioned earlier, cultural identities are an important factor here as well. So we cannot state that a particular national culture represents only one particular type. However, of course, we can identify some similarities in the cultures. And why this is important to you working with multicultural virtual teams is, of course, there can be some clashes, some misunderstandings when low context and high context people meet. So quite often low context people tend to be very blunt and very straightforward, very direct. And therefore, people who are more high context and prefer to put a lot of communication in the nonverbal cues and in interpretation of the messages, they can find the low context people a bit rude even. And at the same time, the low context people find it difficult to understand what exactly the high context people mean, because there's so much to be interpreted in the context of the message. So, of course, in terms of virtual teams, these can become more difficult to interpret. So you have to consider how you're going to find that out. And in terms of decision making, this can also show in different ways. So, for example, in terms of identifying the problem, making proposals, or finding solutions, these different types tend to approach this topic differently. So please have a look at these examples and think how these could apply to your team. Another aspect that Hall looked at was time perception, how we organize time and behavior. And you have two different types here, monochronic and polychronic cultures. And again, although we have these national and geographic boundaries, please consider again that these may not apply to your team specifically, but may be more individualistically approached. However, monochronic cultures tend to be very linear in their time approach. They plan things one thing at a time, go step by step, very fully organized, and they follow the plan strictly. They don't really go, out of the box thinking, so to say, and are also focused on more short-term relationships that are related to the project and completing that at one go. Whereas these polychronic cultures tend to be a bit more flexible in their time approach. They tend to be also more high context. They tend to focus on people and relationships more, and also focus on long-term orientation. And they are more focused on who they are working with rather than what they are working with, which was the case with the monochronic cultures. And then how this framework was developed was with the Lewis model, who focused on dimensions of linear active, multi-active, and reactive, where he defined them as linear active people being very task-oriented, highly organized, following linear time approach, multi-actives being more emotional and impulsive people who like to multitask and focus on people and change plans quickly, whereas then reactives are those who are good listeners and in a way following and trying to interpret what other people are doing and then focusing on that. And this is what that framework looks like. You can see the colors there identifying the different types. And again, just to remind you that these are done at a certain time, and times are changing, globalization, digitalization, everything is affecting the whole world globally. So these may also change, but we can find some similarities, and this categorization may help you to interpret your team. So have a look at the definitions and think if your virtual team has some identifications of this. One more aspect related to linguistic diversity is English as a lingua franca, and in general language skills and verbal, non-verbal skills as well, and how to deal with the linguistic differences in your team. And of course, there may be some challenges that this causes, because people may not understand each other. They may focus on, using the wrong kind of terminology that causes actual difficulties, but this, on the other hand, can also create opportunities, because then, due to the lack of appropriate terminology or language skills, they may focus on putting extra effort on the interaction and the relationship. And in terms of working in virtual teams, the importance of media choice is emphasized. And therefore, it is important to think which tool is suitable to support the communication and the language skills of the team. There's also professional diversity in the team that may add value in terms of bringing more innovation, or it can also create challenges because people may not understand each other's professions properly, or they may not be able to communicate their views appropriately. So how to handle the conflicts then, which are inevitable, as we said. So you can find some more examples and theoretical frameworks on the slides, but one example is this use of emotional intelligence. So it's important that you, as the leader of the team, focus on your emotional intelligence and how to understand your team and manage the emotions and feelings of yourself as well as others. And of course, in terms of managing, you have to manage the emotions, but also manage the situation and the solution that follows. So please have a look at these examples and think about how you can manage those conflicts and your emotions in those conflicts. So what are the recommendations? It is to establish common ground and develop strategies to communicate these diverse perspectives. So be aware that your team is diverse, and what are the different diversities in your team, and how can you manage those diversities and make them add value rather than create the conflict. But however, during the conflicts, how are you able to manage those conflicts? And of course, think about the media that you choose and how can that support the diversity within your team. Please have a look at the suggested readings and visit our interactive guide, How to Lead Virtual Teams, and let's move on to stage 3.